there is not enough force concentration in Ukraine to warrant the use of nuclear weapons to make it militarily make sense. So like then the only purpose it can have is like a shock purpose, a psychological one,
a symbolic.
But like but then that's where then we go back to scenario one, right? Like you have no real impact, but you have a shit ton of political backlash.
Yeah.
So why would you want to do it?
Yeah.
I don't get it.
Yeah.
And that's the third reason.
Yeah.
And that's the overwhelming one. Putin knows if he uses nuclear weapons, NATO cannot stand outside this conflict anymore. NATO will have to get involved. Because if Putin employs a nuclear weapon and we don't get involved in the conflict, well, then you will see a lot of proliferation all around the world. You will basically see the entire security structure breaking down. I mean, if we let Putin get away with impunity for employing a nuclear weapon, I mean, what is like all our normative values that we built up over the last decades, our system, what is it worth? I would say nothing at that point. And I'm pretty sure the United States and the allies, they know that. And they have communicated that to Putin. So Biden has said, like in public statements, I'm pretty sure through backdoor channels that has been reiterated several times, if you start employing nuclear weapons in Ukraine, we will put an end to your special military operation extremely fast. And to do that, NATO does not even need to put boots on the ground. So I'm pretty sure that the United States alone, they could deploy a massed cruise missile strike. So let's say we send 500 to 1,000 cruise missiles at every military relevant target inside Ukraine that is valuable to Russia. And let's say in the border area, strike every of these targets with 2 or 3 cruise missiles. This military operation is over. There is nothing left. And that is a very credible threat because that is something that's very easy for the United States to do, right? Like we don't need to start amassing our troops first. We don't need to start deploying tanks in Ukraine. No, like the only threat that we have to make credibly, and I think we make that credibly, is that with a massive airstrike, especially by the United States, but other countries would join, we can end your military operation in an hour. And Putin knows that. I'm 100% convinced of that. And that is if you think like the 2 reasons before that were not convincing enough, this is the single one reason why I know that Putin, or let's say Putin steps down and another person comes in, that person will have the same threat communicated to him or her. So that's why I don't see any scenario where nuclear weapons could produce any benefit for Putin. And then, like the last, because, I have a lot of heated debates with people about that.
Yeah.
And then the last argument always is, but what if Putin is not rational? Or what if Russia is just completely irrational?
Yeah.
I always say, look, the first thing I always say is that right now, Putin's moves, they have not necessarily been very smart, but there was always an element to rationality behind this. So you see that, for example, the prime example is, had Putin not announced mobilization at the end of last year, his front would have collapsed probably around now because there's just not enough manpower. And he's going to start struggling again with manpower very soon. And Putin knew that mobilization is a big risk. It will carry political backlash, which it did in Russia. It was manageable, but he really, really did not want to do it. And he only did it once he really had no other choice. But then he was like, okay, I guess I got to do it. So to me, that shows that he actually has thought a lot about this, and he's still very calculating, very rational. So that is the one thing. And then the second one, if we now just assume that Putin is not rational anymore, I mean, what then is the purpose of all this thinking, right? Like, it's just that's something we have to assume.
Yeah.
Like, otherwise, our policy making cannot make sense because I cannot react, or I cannot try to rationalize the actions of an irrational actor.
Yeah.
So I just think that's a stupid cognitive standpoint to take. Almost.
I think it's almost something that we do as like a mental defense mechanism, because Putin seems so evil that we try to explain it away with, he must be irrational. Nobody could be that evil. Like it's something like that in that direction. But I also want to ask you about that scenario 3 that you talked about. Like NATO has to get involved if they fire a nuclear weapon. Do you think that NATO would have to get involved regardless of whether that is a strategic nuclear weapon or tactical nuclear weapon, or whether they fire it upon the landmass of Ukraine itself, or whether they do a test firing somewhere in the Black Sea? Do you think that happens regardless of all those scenarios? Or let's say they just fire one in the sea somewhere with no fatalities. Do you think NATO would still get involved? What do you think would happen then if they do that?
So the only scenario where I think it's somewhat uncertain is where it's over an unpopulated area outside Ukraine with no casualties. Then there is a question. And I think maybe it's then not even necessary for NATO to get involved, because, like the backlash that Russia will receive from like China and India dropping it like a fly will be enough. But the moment something happens on Ukrainian soil, no question.
But what do you think would be the response from Europe and the US and NATO if they did that? What do you think we would do?
So I'm pretty sure there's a contingency plan in place. And a bunch of measures would be taken. So what you would probably see is so with regard to the airstrike, right? Like you have to coordinate that logistically. That would be difficult. So I would say that takes like 24 to 48 hours to get all the assets to Europe. Probably that would be somewhat choreographed, and probably would see a lot of threats from Russia in the meantime. I don't think that can matter at this point, because you have to react. The United States, like they basically, for them, it's then get enough fighter aircraft and bombers to deploy a large number of cruise missiles in a single strike.
You think they do that even though Russia like fired a nuclear weapon just in the sea somewhere?
No, that is not. No. Like that is the only instance where I think it would be a question of what exactly would happen. But if something happens inside Ukrainian territory, you don't have a choice anymore.
But in the sea would probably be like even more economic sanctions, even more ammunition and support for Ukraine, even more like indirect support. Exactly.
I would say like the big challenge is, like in this airstrike scenario, like that's the thing, like it doesn't automatically mean you have World War III. It could be that Russia just steps down after that. It could obviously be that it starts attacking NATO territory. So one thing, I would be basically one thing I'm more concerned about is let's say NATO gets involved in the war. I'm not that much concerned that the war could be confined to between Russia and NATO inside Ukraine. I think you can do that. I'm a bit more concerned about what happens, around the other borders. So let's see what happens in Estonia, or also around Kaliningrad. And again, I'm pretty sure, like the NATO member states, so Poland, for example, they have a pretty good contingency plan, what they're doing in that situation. Probably. I'm pretty sure they probably have plans to take out Kaliningrad in 24 to 48 hours, something like that. But like that would be a bit of a challenge, right? Because then that is how this war expands. So I mean, pure speculation. We don't know what's going to happen in that moment. But yeah, I mean, I hope it never gets to that. But I just think, if Russia fires a nuclear weapon on Ukraine, there's nothing.
That's it.
No choice.
But let's speculate about this. Let's go in the thinking of this. Let's go, if they do fire a tactical weapon in Ukraine, and then we have NATO, US led mission, take out the whole perhaps Black Fleet with 500 cruise missiles and all these military strategic things. And let's say what happens, different scenarios with regard to how Russia reacts. Like Putin could, he could step down and say, okay, I don't want any more casualties. Let's drop this whole war. But also it's like, I'm thinking he doesn't want to lose. He doesn't see that as an opportunity or a real choice for him, perhaps. And then he says, okay, they want to get involved. Okay, I have these ICBMs standing here. Perhaps I should press my big red button and fire one or two of those at Washington and perhaps New York. And Do you think that is a realistic scenario that he could say like, okay, we go from tactical to strategic nuclear weapons now?
I don't think immediately. I think there would need to be a threat that NATO decapitates the Russian nuclear arsenal before, or destroys the nuclear arsenal before Russia has a chance to fire it. I think then he would be willing to preempt.
Yeah.
So then he would be willing to launch first. I think, what happens, like, so let's say that airstrike came in, the entire logistical capabilities, air defense sites, Black Sea Fleet, troop concentrations inside and outside Ukraine around the border area are destroyed. So it's pretty clear that, like, this military operation is over. Russia has absolutely no chance of winning that war anymore. It happens then, it depends largely on what happens. I think the next step depends on what happens inside the Kremlin. So is there an attempt of getting rid of Putin? How much control does he still have? Because then, like, he has the choice, okay, either I employ more tactical nuclear weapons to hold a NATO advance. But like, that's the thing, right? Like, that's what I just said. Like, NATO does not need to deploy ground troops. We have the power to end this military operation without deploying a single tank into Russia.
Yeah.
Like, that's not necessary. We don't need to roll into the Kremlin to defeat him. So, then it depends. I mean, it also